So my name is Liz Anderson. I'm the Lake County SWCD AIS program coordinator. And we also have Nate Spindler-Craig with us. He's our Conservation Corps apprentice at the SWCD for the summer, and he'll be helping me out too. So yeah, we'll just get rolling. We're gonna start by doing some just quick introductions so we can see where everyone's kind of coming from, what their names are, and just answer a simple question here. So if everyone could just go around, say their name and maybe where they live, town, or if they live on a lake. And then if there's a lake or river that's especially important to you, just be curious to know that. So I can start. My name is Liz, like I said, and I live in Ely. And I wouldn't say that there's any one specific lake or river that's especially important, but I am very, sorry, I just had to admit Robin into the meeting. So I would say, you know, the boundary waters or anything, any of the wilderness lakes up here are particularly important to me. So, all right. Who wants to go next?
I'd be happy to go next.
Oh, go ahead.
Hey, I'm Nate. I'm the apprentice here at the SWCD this summer. Like Liz, I think that the boundary waters is particularly important to me. And I'd also point out my grandparents live in the McGregor area, and the lake that they live on, Round Lake, one of many, is one that's pretty close to my heart.
Well, I'll go next. Jeff Hansen here. I do work on the board of the Waikola White Iron Chain of Lake Association. Happen to live on the shores of Birch Lake in Bay. So Birch Lake happens to be particularly close to my heart. Thank you.
This is Beth Hoopala. Jeffrey Hansen, you live 3 doors down from me or so.
Yep.
I'm Birch Lake. I took my initial AIS training a year ago, and I was involved in that. Liz, I met you. What was it called again that we do every year?
Starry Trek.
Yeah, that's what it is. So I'm happy to be here again and refocusing on this stuff.
Hi, I'm Roxanne Lillis. Am I on?
Yep, we hear you.
Okay, I'm Roxanne Lillis, and I live in Silver Bay. I've lived pretty much my entire life on the North Shore, from Duluth to Grand Portage. And so Lake Superior is what I call home. And the inland lakes, every weekend we spent fishing. And so keeping those inland lakes as pristine as possible and producing fish is very important to me. And my dad used to tell us we come from a family of lake dwellers, because he was born on an island, Maytag Island, in the middle of Dead Lake down in Otter Tail County. And so he was born surrounded by water, and he loved Lake Superior. So that's my story.
And hi, this is Steve Smith. I live in Larsmont, about 3 miles west of Two Harbors. We have one lake that's pretty special to our family. We have a cabin up in Cook County on McFarland Lake, and we've had that thing for about 60 years. So I guess it's pretty special.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
Is that my turn? Nope. Oh.
Robin and Paul, you're left.
Oh, okay. I'll go first if you want. Robin Vora. I have a cabin on White Iron Lake. I'm also on the Waikola board, and I'm the AIS coordinator, aquatic invasive species. And that doesn't mean I'm an expert on it. I still have a lot to learn. And that's why I'm looking forward to this session. I do have to leave after, I might not make it all the way through it, but I'll try and pick up what I can.
All right, Paul, I think it's you.
All right. I don't see myself, but I guess I'm here. Can you hear
Can
me?
hear you.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah,
And we
I've
can
been
see
with.
you, Paul.
Oh, okay.
No hiding
Um,
from us.
I've been with Stillwater for I think 6 years, and I've really enjoyed it. And I wanted to be included tonight. I've always been impressed with the wealth of information that Liz can offer to all of us. And my favorite river is Knife River. I just live on the Knife River, and that's my favorite thing. But so that's it.
Thanks, everyone. We have a good geographic spread in the group too, I think. Pretty interesting. So I'm gonna continue on here. Just talk about what the various things that we will be discussing tonight. So at the end of this evening, you should be able to understand some aquatic ecology basics, know what AIS are and how they move, locate some key habitat areas for AIS for doing your surveys, confidently identify some high-risk AIS species in the area, utilize the AIS Sentry guide, which is the link that I sent with the email, to identify some native and invasive species, report AIS sightings to proper authorities, conduct basic shoreline aquatic plant survey, conduct shoreline aquatic animal survey, and conduct survey for AIS in deeper waters, and also properly trap for crayfish. So just a couple acknowledgements here before we get going. The Sentry program and a lot of the language was adapted from the St. Louis River Alliance AIS Sentry program. And a lot of the information out of this manual also came from Minnesota Sea Grant and Minnesota DNR. And this workshop and the manual was developed with help from Burnside Lake Association, Vermilion Lake Association, Waikola, and St. Louis County SWCD, North St. Louis County SWCD, and Lake County SWCD. So this is going to be a workshop in 3 parts. Part 1 will be just an overview of AIS. Part 2 will be the identification heavy section. So we'll go over high risk species and also some native lookalikes. And then part 3 will go over the early detection and monitoring survey protocols and also some additional resources. So part 1, we'll talk about expectations, define AIS. We'll go over the Minnesota regulations and AIS laws and talk about the impacts that invasive species can have. So everybody might be coming to this with, different goals in mind. You might want to learn, just learn. You might have an intention to protect your favorite fishing spot, etc. What our hope is for you is that you'll get to know a sampling location well enough so that you can recognize when something is not normal. So that might be your own piece of shoreline. If you're a watercraft inspector, that might be an access that you're at frequently. So that's just something that we hope you can observe if there's any changes. We would ask that you might complete at least 1 monitoring session per month during the season, recognizing that some people aren't around for the full season if you're just a part-time resident. We ask that you follow all DNR regulations regarding invasive species and report any suspected AIS as soon as possible. Observe best practices to prevent the spread of AIS. We don't want to be out there looking for AIS and accidentally spread it ourselves. So make sure you're clean, draining, and drying your watercraft and other water-related equipment. And then obviously, should go without saying, but always keep personal safety as a top priority. So boating safety, weather safety, make sure you let someone know if you're going out on the water alone. So definition of AIS, and this is from Minnesota statute. So it's kind of the legal definition in Minnesota, but it's a non-native species. So it's not normally found in an area. And it's an invasive species, means that it's non-native, that it also may cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health, or may threaten natural resources or use of natural resources in the state. So it's a pretty broad definition. It's something that does cause harm, or it could cause harm. And then putting it together, AIS, aquatic invasive species, or invasive species that are in the water. So some important Minnesota regulations to know. And welcome, Marcia. I think I just saw you join. So we're just going over some of the AIS basics right now. And just to cover some of the Minnesota regulations that you should be aware of, there are different categories for invasive species. They're broken out into prohibited species or regulated species. Prohibited species are those that you're not allowed to ever have in your possession. So zebra mussels would be an example of that. A regulated species is something that is legal to possess, but you're not allowed to introduce them. An example of that would be rusty crayfish, which you're allowed to trap and consume. Your fishing license lets you take 25 pounds of rusty crayfish a day if you want, but you're not allowed to release rusty crayfish into a water body. Additionally, you may not transport watercraft without removing the drain plug, arrive at a lake access without a drain plug in place. You can't transport aquatic plants, zebra mussels, or other prohibited species on any roadway. You can't launch watercraft with prohibited species attached. And you're also not allowed to transport any water from Minnesota lakes or rivers without a permit. So that includes things like bait buckets that have been in the water. All right. Any questions on that before I move on?
Liz, I have a question about bait buckets.
Yeah.
If they have a bait bucket
All the yard cleared.
and they do not put it in the water, so they arrive with a bucket with bait in and they don't put it in the water,
You got somebody
they
lined
still
up to
have
come
to
and give
empty
you the
out?
slab or? When?
We're getting some background noise. I think if you're not speaking, maybe you could put yourself on mute and just so I can make sure we hear the question. So you're asking if water goes out, bait water goes out on the lake, and they don't put it in the lake, do they have to dump it? And the answer is technically yes.
Okay,
I know a lot of anglers will debate that because, you know, they'll use the aerated coolers for their bait instead of the kind that you put in the water. And yeah, technically they are supposed to dump that before they leave.
whoever M is the feedback. They're not on mute.
So important.
Yeah, I know. Let's see.
Then he went in
Yeah,
the
I
next
can
year.
Okay. I think I was able to mute them. So, all right. Does that answer your question? Or is that anything else?
Nope,
Okay.
that answered my question. It came up this last week.
Yep. I definitely hear that.
Because he had a aerated, self-contained unit.
Yep.
And I had him dump it, which he didn't have a problem doing, but it was difficult because I've never seen one quite like it.
Yeah.
And I said I would ask. So I asked.
All
I
right,
have a
good.
question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Last October, we were over on Lake Michigan, and there was a beach that was just full of zebra mussel shells. And there were a clump of them together, and there was nothing in them. They were all dried shells. I took some so I could put poly on it so I could show them to people. Is that against the law? Break the law?
Technically, you are supposed to have a permit to collect it like a herbarium or, biological sample.
Okay,
So that I know that one exists in Minnesota. I don't know what the rules and regulations are in if you were in another state, but
yeah, we're in Michigan.
yeah, in Minnesota, you're supposed to have a permit, and it's not necessarily difficult to get that permit, but they just want to make sure that you are aware of all the procedures to follow so that you're not accidentally
Right.
introducing something.
So should I, like, I poly them? Should I throw them
If
away?
it's in poly now, it's probably fine because it's not,
Yeah,
it's totally
it was-
inert.
I was just in such shock
Mm,
on how many there were. I thought, oh my God, I can't let anybody else let them do it to our lakes. That was
mhm.
horrible. And so I just wanted to make sure I had a sample, but yeah, maybe I'll check that out and just let them know I did that, and maybe they'll give me a permit afterwards or something. I don't know.
I would say you probably can leave it alone. It'll probably,
Okay.
it's fine.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to get into what makes invasive species actually invasive and how they're so successful. So invasive species tend to be generalists. They can survive in a lot of different habitats and conditions. Oftentimes they're much more aggressive than the native species they're displacing. They're usually very successful at reproducing. They can reproduce a lot, and they're very, they can survive. And a lot of times they can survive because there's no natural predators. They're not in their native range where they've had predators in the past. They also often have a low susceptibility to disease, so they're able to survive longer. And these are pictures that we have the carp from, this is southern Minnesota. The cane toads are obviously, notorious in Australia, and the Burmese python that has wreaked havoc in the Everglades. So just some examples. This is an illustration of just how invasive species become introduced and then become established in a habitat. So this represents native flowers, and you can see we've got fireweed and bunchberry and starflower and all kinds of native flowers. And if we were to introduce something like hawkweed, at first they just start on the margins and are introduced there, and eventually that becomes an established population, and they keep making inroads, and more hawkweed, less and less native species, and then eventually comes to be that that whole habitat is dominated by that invasive species. And in the end, you might have just a few scattered native plants that remain. And this is called an invasion curve. It shows how once a species is introduced, you have a narrow window of time before that population explodes and there's less that you can do to control it. So when the species is first introduced, you might have a chance to, do some controls that would remove the species and potentially eradicate it once that population jumps. cost of controlling the species goes way up, and you probably are ending up just doing maintenance. I think about the Eurasian water milfoil issues they have down in the Twin Cities area, where they harvest it at the boat access and around the swimming areas, but there's really not much more you can do than that. So just to illustrate how important it is to get that early detection before the species is at such a high density that there's not anything that can really be done about it. And then why are invasive species bad? I like to say that I don't believe there's any, invasive species aren't inherently bad. They're not an evil species. They can't control the fact that they're in the wrong place, but they do cause harm. They do have that potential. So that's what makes them bad. They can decrease biodiversity, displace native habitats. They can cause damage to infrastructure or property. I mean, you can see the pipes down here that have been totally encrusted with zebra mussels or quagga mussels. It can reduce recreational opportunities. Beth, as you mentioned, on the beach, here's another picture of a beach filled with shells. It can cause changes in the food web, decrease property value even. There's also the possibility that it could spread disease or increase allergies or irritations. All right, any questions on that, the invasion? All right. So we're going to move on to identification. And first, we're going to talk a little bit about some, like an intro to aquatic plants. So here I have an example of two guides that I would recommend. The first is the Sentry guide, which I sent you the link to. The second is the Aquatic Plants of the Upper Midwest, which is a really excellent guide if you're interested in aquatic plants in general, because it has really good photographs and descriptions, and it has a key. So I highly recommend that book. Also, I reference minnesotawildflowers.info very frequently. There's a lot of great information on there. And they're a free resource. They do, take donations. It's mostly a volunteer run operation, but it's really excellent. So just kind of getting into some plant part basics. If you're out there trying to identify a plant, these are some of the things to look for. And oftentimes leaf arrangement can be indicative of a species. So you can note whether the leaves are alternating on either side of the stem. Are they opposite of each other? Or are they whorled in a, all the way around the stem, like this one down here? And I should ask, can you see the cursor when I'm moving it on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Yep.
And then the various leaf types, is it just one simple leaf that's attached directly to a stem, or is it a leaflet that's got, multiple, or is it a compound leaf that has multiple leaflets? The milfoil leaf at the top right here is an example of a compound leaf where it has that central axis, and then each of the little fringes is one leaflet on that leaf. The leaf margins are the edges of the leaf. It can be entire where it's smooth, it can be serrate, and the serrated edge could be, fine or very distinct, or it could be undulate, so very wavy. And this is just an example of coontail, I believe, and the stem, which branches at the nodes into it looks like whorled leaflets around the stem. And just a continuation of leaf structure, we can see these leaflets are just different examples of leaflets, the central axis on the milfoil versus the branching, the various branching of the other leaflets that don't have that central axis. So this bladderwort here just continuously branches. This is an example of the margin of the leaf, which looks like it has kind of a fine serrate edge. A stipule is something you see often in pond weeds. It's just this plant part that kind of wraps around the base of the leaflet or the leaf and attaches to the stem as well. So veins are often an identifying feature. So you might have this pondweed looks like with a midvein, and then there's one vein on either side of the midvein. Or on this top right one here, you have two veins on either side of the midvein. So that's something to look for as well. Also the apex, how the tip of the leaf is structured can indicate the species. So this one you can see is more blunt here. And then how the leaf is attached to the stem. So is it clasping? Does it go all the way around the stem? Or does it have a petiole here where it's kind of removed from the stem? Whoops. Or is it sessile? So the leaf is attached directly to the stem. And then some other things to keep in mind are phenology. So when is the plant showing up in the season? Like curly leaf pondweed tends to be a very early season plant. It can even grow underneath the ice. So it tends to come out early and then die back early as well. So that is also indicative of a species. All right, then just talk a little bit about the zones of a lake. We start up on the shoreline, which is the riparian zone. So that's where you have your sedges, your willows, and all those kind of plants that like the water but aren't actually underwater. And then in the littoral zone, you have plants that are either emergent or floating or submerged. And the littoral zone is everywhere in a water body where light can reach the bottom. So that is where you're going to have any rooted plants out in the water itself. The limnetic zone is beyond the point where light can reach the bottom. So if you have plants out here, they're, you know, maybe not true plants, something like algae and things that aren't rooted at all and are just kind of free floating. And they would be in the euphotic zone, which is the area of that limnetic zone where light can still penetrate. And you might find things like spiny water flea out in the limnetic zone. They tend to like very deep lakes, so they're less likely to be near shore. All right, now I'm going to toss it over to Nate, and he's going to talk about submerged and floating leaf plants.
Exactly. We'll start with curly leaf pondweed. Next slide, Liz. If any of you guys made it to the Heritage Days parade last summer, you might have seen Paul dressed up as a very handsome curly leaf pondweed. This is one of those early season weeds that Liz was talking about. Early enough that you can even sometimes see it growing under the ice if it's getting enough light. It's pretty easily identifiable because it looks like lasagna. There's these really crinkly noodle-like leaves on it. It exhibits alternate branching, but you got to be careful because there's a lot of native pondweeds as well. It's bad because it produces really dense mats, and because it's an early season plant, it dies out earlier and decomposes, which decreases the oxygen that's available to fish. Obviously, that's not so good, but thankfully it's not found in too many places around Lake County or in the Arrowhead region. There's a few areas near Vermilion Lake. I think last time I checked EdMaps, it was unconfirmed in Thomas Lake. And then it's up along the border as well. Next slide. So one of the native lookalikes that we see popping up here is clasping leaf pondweed, which we can talk about more on the next one. So there's a variety of native pondweeds as well. Like in the example of a midvein, when we talked about what a midvein looks like on an aquatic plant, the example was from a curly leaf pondweed. And a lot of pondweeds exhibit that midvein-like structure. Looking across the photos, you can see that that's pretty consistent. But one of the things that makes the curly leafed pondweed relatively unique is that from that midvein, you see the secondary veins branch out sideways. That contrasts relatively significantly with most of the native pondweeds, which tend to have secondary veins that branch upwards parallel almost to the midvein. Additionally, there's a few other factors. So for example, the clasping leaf pondweed in the upper left-hand corner is probably the pondweed that's most often confused for curly leaf pondweed. That's because it has these relatively wavy leaves. However, there's one key difference, and it's that it clasps right around the stem. If you get a close-up, it wraps almost all the way around it as it attaches. Other similar pondweeds can include the flat stem pondweed, but that has a flat stem and the leaves don't float quite like the curly leaf pondweed does. White stem pondweed has a really zigzaggy stem that's pretty distinctive. Large leaf pondweed has very ovular leaves instead of these almost long rectangular leaves of the curly leaf pondweed. And they're really large and they don't exhibit that crinkly edge. And then Robbins pondweed is, I don't know, relatively similar to flat stem pondweed, but it exhibits this sort of opposite, not quite opposite, but less of a nodal structure by comparison. Next slide. The next two plants that we'll talk about are hydrilla and Brazilian waterweed, both of which are not found in Minnesota right now, thankfully. These two plants are similar in that they share whorled leaves. In hydrilla, we see leaves that are in whorls of 3 to 10, but typically 5. The picture in the bottom right-hand corner is a pretty good example of that. Hydrilla has really good tubers, well, really bad tubers in that they can survive on a lake bed for several seasons, which is good for the continued existence if you're hydrilla, but really bad if you're trying to eliminate it in a lake or control its spread. Leaves are quite serrated and they have a midvein, but they're really finely serrated, as you can see in the photo. It has a wide range of depth tolerances, and again, it tends to form dense mats and causes changes to light, temperature, water movement, oxygen, and pH. The closest locations are in Northeast Wisconsin and Iowa, south of Des Moines. So not very close, but it's been on a pretty steady westward trek for quite a while. So good to keep an eye out for it. Next slide. Another similar one in that it shares whorled leaves is the Brazilian waterweed, which is also not yet in Minnesota. This one has leaves that are seen in whorls of 4 to 6 leaves, most often 4, I believe, and they're really finely toothed, even more finely toothed than hydrillas are. It has these really pretty white flowers that you can see in the upper right-hand corner, but as you can also see in that photo, it forms really thick and bushy mats and generally looks pretty gross. Next, hit the arrow button. These two plants are often confused with Canadian waterweed, which is a native plant, and we like it here. which you see in whorls of 3 most typically. You'll occasionally see whorls of 4, but those are relatively rare, and you'll tend to see 3 up along a stem. This is distinct because the edges are smooth, they're continuous. So that's good. And I don't know, keep an eye out for hydrilla and Brazilian waterweed, especially if people are transporting boats from out of state. Next. One of the algae, actually, so it's not technically a plant, but it's an algae, is starry stonewort, which is a macroalgae. It has really smooth stems, and branching occurs in whorls in this sort of short, long pattern, as we can see in that top photo. The most distinctive feature of starry stonewort are the little star-shaped bulbils that occur around nodes. This is sort of the key thing to look for when you're identifying it, I believe. It's possible that Liz has other tricks, but if I'm trying to identify it, I'm looking for those bulbils always. It exists in the cities and I guess generally a little bit west of here in the Red Lake and Cass Lake regions. And like a lot of these invasive plants, forms a really dense mat. It's often found in deep water and slow moving water. Next. We do have stoneworts that are native to Minnesota. Again, these are a macroalgae. The biggest difference is that the branchlets fork symmetrically. Rather than forking in a whorl around a node, they'll fork off just sort of like that. We also have chara, also known as musk grass, which is pretty different because the branchlets are not forked, and it exhibits a really musky odor. Like when you pick up musk grass, you know that you've picked up musk grass. Additionally, it's pretty rough stemmed. So if you kind of rub it between your fingers, it'll be relatively clear compared to nitella, like regular stonewort or starry stonewort. Next. Eurasian water milfoil is one of the most well-known aquatic invasive plants in Minnesota, and it's one of the most feared, I think. It's really prevalent around the cities, and it is definitely in a few lakes up here. Not too many in Lake or Cook counties though, which is really good for us right now. You'll see it in whorls of 4 with, I guess, 4 leaflets around the main stem. Each leaf has 12 to 21 pairs of leaflets. This is a lot. When you look at a Eurasian water milfoil leaf, you'll notice a much denser mat of leaflets on each leaf than on a native water milfoil. Additionally, you can always tell that it's Eurasian water milfoil because it looks really feathery in the water. The native water milfoils don't look so feathery, and they just feel much more firm in your fingers. The stem color can be pretty variable, and there's a lot of native water milfoils that you can maybe confuse with Eurasian water milfoil, but one of the biggest problems is that it will hybridize. So it's really important to keep it out of lakes up here. And sometimes the hybrids are kind of challenging to identify. Water milfoil is bad because it shades out native species and really significantly interferes with recreation, as we've seen in the cities. Like Liz was talking about how the management techniques for water milfoil, for Eurasian water milfoil, are mostly just to manage it in very small areas when you can. It's in Superior. It's really prevalent around the cities. Keep an eye out for it. Next slide. Next one. So there's a few native water milfoils that people will often pick up and think, well, this looks sort of like Eurasian water milfoil. Can you check this out? These include on the left, northern water milfoil, which is really, really common. This, along with a lot of the pondweeds, are sort of the vegetation that you'll really commonly see that's completely submergent. This is distinctive because there's only 4 to 11 pairs of leaflets per leaf around that really strong midvein. Additionally, these native water milfoils fan out. On the left of this picture in the bottom left corner is Eurasian water milfoil, which has a very ovular leaflet shape, whereas northern water milfoil exhibits a fan-like shape. Another native water milfoil is world water milfoil. This you can tell, this you can identify because most leaves don't have a stalk. You'll see the first pair of leaflets on a leaf branching out almost immediately from the stem of the plant. Additionally, it has 8 to 17 pairs of leaflets per leaf, and it's a relatively uncommon water milfoil to find. Finally, variable leaf water milfoil has sort of feathery leaves, but as you can see, they're full leaves and they don't have leaflets on them. It's a pretty rare species to find. Next. So finally, or actually no, these are also species that are sometimes confused with Eurasian water milfoil. On the left, we have water marigold. In the center, we have coontail. And on the right, we have spiny hornwort. Water marigold has leaves that branch continuously. That's the middle left image on the bottom. So I guess on the bottom from left to right, we have northern water milfoil, water marigold, spiny hornwort, and coontail, I believe. And you can see with all of these, you either get continuous branching, almost reminds me of a lightning strike in the sky, or coontail, you get a bunch of things, far more leaves coming off from the stem in a pretty straight manner. Additionally, if you're trying to identify coontail, you'll see the top of the plant and being much more dense than the lower parts of the plant. And spiny hornwort, I guess, to me, reminds me of a little bit more of a feathery, sort of like a feather boa, a little bit more than Eurasian water milfoil does. And then water marigold often has these interesting flowers and emergent leaves that are pretty unique to it. Next. Actually, does anybody have questions about these ones that we've talked about before we continue on to the rest of them?
I'm just going to comment. This is Beth. When I did the Starry trek last year, it's so easy to look at these pictures and decide what they are. But what I realized is they're never in one piece, in one whole stem, so that you can see the whole thing. So I think it's probably a lot harder to identify AIS than terrestrial invasives. So, well, when I do the Starry again, Liz, bear with me. That's all.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I was doing aquatic vegetation surveys last summer with Liz a little bit. And when you pick up a small chunk of a plant, it's really challenging.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know, having a good dichotomous key can be really helpful if you have something like that. Otherwise, I don't know, otherwise taking a picture and contacting Liz is not a bad option. Sorry to volunteer for that, Liz. But
just an observation, because it looks so easy here, but it's not.
Yeah.
To tell.
Okay. Yeah. No, exactly. When you're comparing it to something that you know it's not, then it feels easy. But yeah, brittle naiad is another invasive species, which is distinctive for being quite brittle compared to the native lookalike, which is slender naiad. You can see the leaves, and you can see the leaves being extremely toothed. Like it almost looks like they have actual teeth on them. Rather, rather than just being like a normal serrate leaf. The leaves tend to be opposite, or they sometimes appear in a whorled sort of manner, but it's generally an opposite branching structure, and it's a really small little plant. The nearest location where it's found is in the Twin Cities. The native lookalike slender naiad is flexible. It doesn't have teeth. It's really smooth. And it gets a lot larger than brittle naiad tends to. So that can be helpful if you're trying to identify them. Next slide. So there's a few more species that are not in Minnesota and aren't quite around here that are good to keep an eye out for, I suppose. Some of them are just kind of cool. So parrot feather is relatively, I guess I've seen a lot of examples on the internet of it being a little bit more emergent than a lot of the plants we've discussed previously. Kind of towards the edge of the littoral zone, growing in the water and then starting to grow out of the water as it gets older or as water levels drop. The leaves almost remind me of like a cedar tree in a way, which might be a sort of questionable comparison, but it works in my head. Yeah, you'll see a relatively thick stem and leaves with one main stem and then a lot of different leaflets coming off. I don't remember the exact number of them. And then the other three plants tend to form mats on top of the water surface. European frogbit looks a lot like lily pads, but they tend to be quite small. I think like 4 to 6 centimeters across. I wouldn't quote me on that, but really small heart-shaped lily pads forming dense mats on top of the water. And then the flowers have this white petals around them and a yellow core, which can be a sign that it's frogbit. Water hyacinth is often like an aquarium or a garden pond plant that people will manage themselves because the flowers look really cool, like we see in that photo, but it's not good. And water lettuce as well is an invasive species of concern. All of these species because they form really dense mats on top of the water. Liz, do you have anything else that you want to say about these ones?
No, I just wanted to put it out there and say that there's others that are kind of in the periphery that, you know, could become a concern further down the road, but just as a, you know, just to be aware that there's others out there, not quite knocking on our door, but maybe someday, hopefully not.
Yeah, hopefully not. Next slide, Liz. We do have a few cool species that are in our water right now that we'd like to point out. Common bladderwort, I find really, really fascinating. While we were doing aquatic vegetation surveys last summer, sometimes we'd pull the rake up and it would just be thick with bladderwort. And it's probably most identifiable because you get these little, I guess not quite nodes, but these little tiny bladders on it that are sort of a harder substance. You can sort of pick them off and rub them between your fingers if you want. Really, really cool. I also feel like you'll often, like when we pull it out of the water, we often pull it out with a relatively significant amount of sediment on it. So that might be the case if you're pulling it out of the lake. It also has these super pretty yellow flowers on it in the upper right-hand corner. There's also a couple of floating plants that are pretty cool, or you'll mostly see them as floating plants, including water shield on the left and dwarf yellow pond lily on the right. These beautiful yellow flowers with sort of red-tipped stamen on them, which I think is really cool. Next slide. And then burreeds are, I think they're in the cattail family. And you'll often find them sticking out of the water towards the edge of the littoral zone between sort of there and the shore. with these really, really, I mean, they're basically cattail leaves sticking out of the water, slightly rounded a little bit again, pointy at the end, really pretty. And then they have nice flowers that you can see later in the season. Arrowheads, as the name suggests, the terminal leaf looks like an arrowhead. You'll often see water celery floating away. I don't know. I was always mystified by that when I was a kid. And I never knew quite what it was, but water celery is, you'll see one little strand of it floating around in the water. Then quillworts look like a sea urchin, almost a little bit. But there's not a lot of plants that look quite like a quillwort does. I've never seen one in person, but I hope to. Anybody else have questions or comments that you'd like to share?
I just wanted to comment that I, in the presentation, I just added some of those native plants at the end because I think they're cool, and I think they deserve a mention even if they're not being compared to invasive species. All right, I'm gonna take it back and we're gonna go into emergent and shoreline plants. So purple loosestrife is one that probably many of you are familiar with. It's been around in Minnesota for quite a while. It can reach 4 to 10 feet in height. The stem has multiple ridges or is kind of square. The leaves are opposite, smooth and lance shaped. It has a showy magenta colored flower spike. It was introduced as an ornamental, so it's a very pretty flower. Can't say anything against it in that regard. Individual flowers have 5 to 7 petals. And the issue with it is that it tends to form monotypic stands, and it can even go so far as altering wetland hydrology. There are some places down in southern Minnesota where they have gone into wetlands and just completely taken over the entire system. And up here, they have not quite taken off. They have been introduced in numerous places, including some of the lakes in the boundary waters. Why can't I think of it? Yeah, Little Gabbro. They're in Knife Lake, I believe, and then quite a few places in southern Lake County as well. So they're around. They've been around. They tend to kind of stay in small clusters, and they haven't done quite as much damage as they have down south, but still definitely something to keep an eye out for, and to prevent and to eliminate if possible. And in fact, it is on the noxious Minnesota Department of Agriculture's noxious weed list, that you're required to control it on your property. So one of the native lookalikes is fireweed, and it is actually fairly easy to distinguish the two. But if you're just driving on the road and you're going at 50 miles an hour, sometimes I do a double take and think like, oh, was that loosestrife? Oh no, it was just fireweed. So that is one that you can keep an eye out for. Flowering rush. So this is one, it looks very much like other rush species unless it's flowering. So it's hard to identify if there are no flowers. But the flowers do grow in this kind of umbrella shape, and they're quite pretty as well. They have 3 whitish pink petals on each flower. The stems resemble bulrushes, but they're triangular in cross section. They can grow to about 3 feet in height. The dense stands can interfere with recreational lake use and crowd out native plants. Nearest locations to this area are Big Sandy Lake, multiple places near Grand Rapids, and they're also having real problems with it up in Lake of the Woods. So this is definitely a habitat that would be suitable for flowering rush if it ever got in here. There was, you can see on this map, this green pin in Silver Bay, near Silver Bay, there was a mistaken identification there, and someone went out to check on it and found that there was no actual flowering rush there. So that's what that means. It's not that there is something in Silver Bay. Narrowleaf cattail. So we have native broadleaf cattail, but narrowleaf is an invasive plant, and it can grow up to 10 feet in height. Its leaves are slightly convex on the back, and they're narrow. It's narrower than the broadleaf cattail, which makes sense. The flowering stalk is light green, stiff and round in cross section. The soft seeds cluster in a sausage shape. That's similar to broadleaf cattail. But the gap between the male flowers on the top and the female flowers on the bottom are, the gap is about an inch or more. So that's what you'd be looking for. And that is different from the native broadleaf cattail, where the flower on the top and the bottom are touching or nearly touching. There is a hybrid of the two, and that the characteristics of the hybrid are similar to that of narrowleaf cattail. So they might have a gap as well between the flowers. The issues with them are that they form dense monotypic stands. It can sometimes even break off and form floating islands. They have issues with this up at Voyageurs National Park, where big clumps of cattails have broken off and just like floated around the lake and caused issues. So there are quite a few locations nearby. This is kind of established in the area. There's a lot more than is what is shown on this map here, but they're there and they are hybridizing, and if there is a location where it's causing major issues, then it's worth managing. Right now, it hasn't quite reached that point, as far as I'm aware. Yellow iris is one that some people are surprised is an invasive species. It has that typical iris look to it with the broad sword-shaped leaves and deep yellow flowers with 3 drooping sepals. It stands 2 to 3 feet tall. It's hard to distinguish it from the blue flag iris, which is native, unless it's flowering. So you need to be able to see that yellow flower versus the blue flower. The yellow iris is toxic, and the sap can cause skin irritation too. So apart from just dominating shoreline habitat, it can also be a hazard to humans and animals. Pickerel weed I wanted to mention because it is a native plant, but it can at times become invasive or act like an invasive. So it's sometimes managed in wild rice lakes. There's some indigenous resource managers that will manage it so that it will not impede wild rice from growing in certain lakes. All right, any questions on plants before we move on to animals? I know that's like a ton of information that we just threw at you, but that's why the resources that I listed are so helpful. You can go back and refer to them later. And I didn't mention, but I will be making this presentation into a PDF, so I will send that out as well. All right. moving on then. Spiny water flea is one that probably most of you have heard of or familiar with, maybe even seen on your fishing line. So they're small zooplankton with a long, sharply barbed tail. You can see the size of it from the fingers that are holding this one here. It has a dark eye spot. When it's in high numbers, high density, it can form clumps with black spots on monofilament line or downriggers, and the clumps can feel like wet cotton, I've heard it described. It is carnivorous and feeds on other plankton species. So there was recently a study that found that young of the year walleye 12% smaller in lakes with spiny water flea. So it really does have an impact on the food web. It can also impede angling recreation by just gunking up fishing line. It has this diurnal migration pattern where it goes deep in the lake when it's light out and closer to the surface when it's dark. Other native plankton do sometimes clump on the fishing line, but that spiny tail is very indicative of the spiny water flea. So there are quite a few locations nearby with spiny water flea. Burnside Lake has quite a high density. Shagua, they're present, but less dense. Fall Lake, they're present, but rarely seen. They're also in Vermilion and Basswood, and hopefully not moving in the area. Oh, and Lake Superior, of course. We do see quite a few anglers come out of Superior in the summer with spinies on their fishing line.
Last year, Liz, they were so abundant on Lake Superior. They were seeing them on their fish locators.
Oh my.
The egg masses, and the downriggers were bringing them up, and it was like somebody had dumped green yellow slime on the back of their boats. It was just awful and thick, and I mean you could scoop them by the handfuls. And they were still in the egg mass at that time, and they were pulling them up from really deep a lot with their downriggers, and it was a mess. And I think it's because we had such a warm summer, because they hatched early, and they really overpopulated, I think, last year. I haven't seen any so far this year because I think it's too cold for them to come to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
When you touch the spines, are they like sticky, like a sticker, or are they soft that you would never know that's what you're touching?
No, they're pretty firm.
Are they?
Yep.
But they're really, really tiny. It's like they're about the size of a dandelion seed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So zebra mussels, I'm sure everybody's heard plenty about. They're the zebra mussels and quagga mussels, which are related, are thumbnail size, typically under an inch, but up to 2 inches as an adult. But as villagers, which is their larval stage, they're very small, microscopic even. So they have this blackish brownish D-shaped shell. So they have this flat edge, and then a rounded side as well. And that flat edge, they're actually able to kind of stand up on. Quagga mussels apparently cannot sit upright on that flat side. They're usually in clusters of individuals on hard surface. Native mussels typically are in softer surfaces. Quagga mussels can also survive in softer substrates in deeper waters. Zebra mussels are distinctive in that they have byssal threads, which are hairs essentially at the valve area, which can help them attach to the hard surfaces. This also helps them attach to things like plants, so they can be moved by boats that have vegetation hanging off of them as well. Zebra mussels are filter feeders, so adult mussels can filter up to 1 liter of water per day. So they are also they also have a role to play in restructuring food webs when they're introduced. They remove plankton and reduce food for native species, similar to the spiny water flea. They are somewhat limited by calcium availability in the water, which is one reason why we see many more zebra mussels down in southern and central Minnesota as opposed to up here. We do tend to have lower calcium levels, although there are exceptions. But it is still a concern. For one thing, there are lakes with higher calcium levels. For example, Tofty Lake and Moose have pretty high calcium. And you can still have lakes like Rainy Lake, where they've discovered zebra mussel veligers, even though they don't have any signs that there are adults that are able to survive. They still have zebra mussel veligers. So nearest locations are Lake Superior. There was a sighting in Crooked Lake in Lake County. However, subsequent surveys have not found any adult mussels there. Gilbert Pit and some of the other pit lakes near Virginia. And last year it was discovered in Rainy Lake as well. Or perhaps that was 2 years ago. I'm getting that mixed up. And they were first found in Minnesota in 1989 in the Duluth Harbor. Snails. So I just kind of clumped all the snails together because snails can be pretty difficult to identify without professional consultation. One exception might be the mystery snail, which is, it can be, you know, golf ball sized. So it's pretty large. I put the mystery snail next to the native Campyloma species, which is probably the closest lookalike. The Campyloma is a little bit more narrow, whereas the mystery snail tends to be more round, kind of has that bulbous shape. So if you see snails in a high abundance, something that you haven't seen in the past, that's probably the point when you might want to be concerned, especially these little snails. New Zealand mud snail and faucet snails are both invasive snails. Faucet snails can be a host for a pathogen and could be cause real harm, but they are difficult to identify. But if you see them in high numbers in places where you haven't ever seen them before, that's when you might be suspicious. So nearest locations of faucet snails are in Winnibigoshish and Superior. There's mystery snails in Burnside Lake and Vermilion. And because they're in Burnside, they're obviously moving, you know, downstream. So they'll be heading toward Chagua and Fall Lake. And then last year, we did discover that they are in Lax Lake in southern Lake County as well. New Zealand mud snails have not yet been found in northeastern Minnesota. Rusty crayfish. So rusty crayfish is probably our most charismatic, I guess, invasive species. It is pretty abundant in this area. All these red lakes on the map contain rusty crayfish. It's a crustacean, so it looks like a lobster. especially after it's boiled. It looks bright red, just like a mini lobster. Rusty crayfish have thick black bands with orange tips on their claws. You can see it in this upper picture here. They typically have rust colored sides on the carapace. So the carapace is this part of the shell here. And there's that rusty spot, and that's pretty typical, although it's not always present. This rusty crayfish on the right is found in North Coishui River, and its coloration is very different. It is lacking that spot on the side. It has kind of taupe color, and then this kind of dark band on the tail. So color can vary. That black and orange tip, and then also when the claws are closed, it tends to leave an opening. There tends to be a gap in the claw. They do tend to be larger than native species. And the problems that they cause are they tend to be lawnmowers of the water. So they eat a lot more vegetation than the native counterparts. That affects fish habitat. It alters ecology in other ways. It can compete native species for habitat. And they also are far more aggressive than the native crayfish species, and they've pretty much wiped out native species where they have been introduced. So like I said, nearest location, they're in quite a few lakes in the area. They are native to the Ohio River Basin, so they're not from outside of the United States, but they're still a ways from their native range. And they're first found in Minnesota in 1999. But the good news on the crayfish front is that because of regulations, we haven't seen any new introductions of crayfish into new lakes. They've been moving through connected waters, but we haven't seen any new introductions for decades. So I think that's really promising. Some native and native/invasive crayfish. So the yellow highlight here is northern clearwater, which is a crayfish species that's native to the Lake Superior Basin, but it has kind of expanded its range into the Rainy River Basin. So they're very prevalent in the Lake Superior Basin, in places like the Baptism River. They're just thick in there, but they have been introduced into Fall Lake, Moose Lake, they're in Basswood. So they're invasive, but they're still not as invasive as rusty crayfish. So they have not been causing as much problems, and they still can't compete with the rusty crayfish. And then our two native species are the virile crayfish, or virilis, and calico, or immunis. Virile crayfish tend to be pretty varied in color. They do often have these really pretty blue claws that tend to have these bumps on them. And then calico often is kind of this mottled camo color, but it can vary a bit as well. But their identifying feature is often the claw, which you often get this bump on the inside. It's not so easy to see in this picture, but there's a bump on the inside of that claw. And then on the outside, there's a notch that often has these little tufts of little hairs coming out. So that is some ways that you can identify the calico crayfish. All right, any questions about animals? All right. So we'll move on to surveying and reporting. So I wanted to point out these references. The first is on the DNR website. You can find these under the Lake Finder app. The Minnesota Biological Survey does plant surveys, and they're all posted on, if they've been done on a lake. Not all lakes have had them done, but if they have been done on a lake, they're on the Lake Finder site. And so you can see what plants have been observed on a lake. So if you're on Birch Lake and you want to see what you might expect to find when you go out and survey, you could check that out. I recommend doing that. I would also, before you go, check the DNR infested waters list, and that is updated usually monthly, I believe. And if you're going out to a new lake or somewhere you don't know the infestation status, I definitely recommend checking that out. The one thing I would say about that is the DNR does not track all invasive species, which may seem strange, but they track all of the prohibited invasive species, and they track some regulated species. So for example, they track every lake where there's zebra mussels, but they don't track rusty crayfish at all. They also don't track Chinese mystery snail, but they do track spiny water flea, which is a regulated invasive species. So that is one place you can look. The other is EdMaps, which is, I would say, it should be your #1 hub for finding out where invasive species have been observed. It's a national and actually now international, because I believe Canada uses it as well, database for invasive species observations, and is actually the primary means by which the DNR, the Minnesota DNR, would like to have invasive species reported. So that will come up again later, but the edmaps.org website has great distribution maps as well for all invasive species. So you want to plan out where you're going to search. You know, for you, it might be just the shoreline outside of your property, or if you're concerned about a specific area of the lake. For example, there are higher risk areas where people are more often found or active, say at a beach or a park, at a public water access. Inlets or outlets are always good places to check too, especially if you know that a place upstream has invasive species, but they haven't yet made it to your lake. And then if you're very ambitious, you could check the entire littoral zone. So on that DNR Lake Finder, you can find bathymetry charts, which are the lake depth charts, and you can find out how deep that, or at what point light no longer reaches the bottom of the lake, and base your search on that. This wavy line here is an example of a meander survey. This is from the DNR, from one of their early detection manuals, survey manuals. And this is a meander survey. So you tell yourself, you know, you find 20 random sample points along a meander, you paddle around, boat around, and then you toss a rake every so often to see what you get. So there's a number of different, you know, scopes to what kind of surveys that you can do depending on the time that you can commit or the interest that you have. And maybe it's just, you know, the shoreline outside of your house, and that is great. So we're gonna go through a survey protocol, and this is just a quick 5-minute video that I'm gonna show, and I took it directly from the University of Minnesota Extension's Starry Trek program. And it explains how to do a rake truss survey on your shoreline. So I'm gonna go ahead and start that up. I think. Oh, maybe it's not gonna work. Okay. I think it's not going to work because I'm recording. Maybe I was able to do it last year, but it's not going to play. So it's a little hard to describe it, but let's see. I'm going to go back and we can see this gentleman tossing a rake. So this is the high-tech tool that we use to do plant surveys. And the rake is just a, you know, standard garden rake, 2 of them tied back to back so that you have the tines facing out. And when you have it attached to a tether, you can toss it out. And then when you pull it back in, you will have plants, and then you'll be able to identify what's on it, unless all you have in the lake are rocks, in which case you have to be careful not to get it stuck, which has been a problem in the past. But it is a great tool, and we recommend that when you get to the shoreline, that you select 5 places kind of equidistant along the shoreline to toss the rake from, and that could include from the end of a dock, but just so you're kind of getting a varied picture of, you know, the littoral zone around that shoreline. Let's see here. Okay. So yeah, we'll walk our way along 100 feet of shoreline to either side of the access or your property. So about 200 feet in total, but making sure that you're not trespassing on other property. Look for floating plant fragments, look for emergent plants, look for riparian wetland plants, and then use that aquatic plant rake to collect and closely examine submerged plants. You also can look for aquatic invertebrates under rocks or attached to hard substrates. Inspect long-standing underwater structures for zebra or quagga mussels, such as dock supports, submerged logs, rocks, etc. And I would also say not just zebra quagga mussels, but also snails. And if you have a D-net, you can use that to sample for invertebrates that might be out of sight as well. I suggest, like I said before, using EdMaps to submit any observations of invasive species that you might find. The great deal with that is that your report is submitted directly to a verifier, and that verifier is probably going to be someone with the DNR. And they'll look at your report and determine whether or not it is actually an observation of an invasive species. And if it is, then it will go up on the website. So it doesn't, it's not like iNaturalist, where every observation goes up, it does have to go through a approved verifier in order to go up on the website and be included in their distribution maps. But because of that, the DNR knows right away of any new invasive species observations as well. So that is their preferred method of finding it out. On the left is the image of the web application. They're just the website. You can go and report there. Or if you're going to be doing a lot, I would recommend getting it on your mobile device as well. The picture on the right is the Great Lakes Early Detection Network, which is actually their older app. I should have replaced it. They're going to be phasing that out and just going with the EdMaps generally. So that can be found on wherever you get your apps, and I absolutely recommend it. It also acts as identification tool as well, so that's very helpful. So this is just an example of some of the information that you would need to gather when you are making an observation. Obviously, you need the species, and then you need a date, whether it was positive or negative. If you think it was actually just, there is some merit in, posting a native species that others might confuse for an invasive species. So that's a possibility. What the survey area is, how much of the area is infested, what's the habitat like, the abundance. Some of these are required and some aren't. And then it will ask you your location, because that will be really important for the verifier to know where it was. You can either, use your phone's GPS, or you can place a marker at the position on the map where you were when you observed it. And then there's the option of uploading images, and that part is really important, to take good quality images, and that will help the verifier be able to determine whether it is actually an invasive species or not without having to go out there in person to check. And so here are some tips on taking good pictures. So like I said, they prefer an electronically submitted report through EdMaps website or through the application. So it will send the report to the DNR AIS specialist. When you send that report in, it is, recommended that you contact the DNR invasive species specialist to confirm that they received that report. You can find that information on the DNR website. So for taking photos, make sure you get one photo that includes the entire plant or animal, one photo of the general area where it was found. So you can see like, looking off to the left side of this dock here. One picture of the species with an object for scale. That could be your hand. If you happen to have a ruler with you, that's useful. And then one close-up picture of the species with identifying features. So here is, enough detail that you could count each individual leaflet and confirm. If you need to, you can collect a sample. It's not always necessary, and sometimes the DNR would prefer if you did not collect a sample, but if you think it's necessary and if there's not enough identifying features then you might want to collect a sample. And in that instance, what you'd want to do is preserve it. So wrapping aquatic plants in a damp paper towel, sealing it in a sampling bag, and then if you have an animal, seal it in a sealed container, store it in a sealed container, and then store all samples on ice if possible, and that will help preserve it. Make sure you label it on the outside in permanent marker, and then on a piece of paper inside the container in pencil. Make sure you note the water body name, the county, access name, date, your name, and contact information. And then it needs to be delivered to the DNR's invasive species specialist or the nearest DNR office. So state law allows you to transport invasive species directly to the Minnesota DNR in a sealed container for purposes of identifying the species or reporting the presence of the species. So you wouldn't be able to take it to me. You'd have to, bring it directly to the DNR specialist. Just listing some additional resources here. This will be in the PDF, so you'll have access to that as well, but just some other places you can go to learn more about invasive species. And if you have questions about the laws and specific invasive species, these are great resources here. And then to just wrap up, I'll take questions in a second if you have any, but just wanted to mention that the in-person training is going to be on Saturday, June 18th at 10 o'clock at Wide Iron North Public Water Access for anyone who is around and able to come. And so if you're not aware of where that is, it's off the Quishwe Trail on Pine Road, and the access is on Pine Road with asphalt turns to gravel. So we'll meet there at 10, and we'll do some I'll have some crayfish there that we can practice identifying, and we'll also look at some aquatic plants as well. And then if anyone who shows up wants to do their own surveys in the future, they can take a rake home with them as well. So I guess that's all I have, but be glad to have any questions or any discussion if you have any other comments. I guess not. So great. Thank you so much for showing up, and I hope it was helpful and sparked your interest. And like I said, there's lots of other great resources out there if this has been just kind of a whirlwind.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Liz. That helps. It's a lot of stuff,
And
though.
Nathan.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Nathan.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely encourage everyone to get some practice, and if you can make it on Saturday, that'd be great. And it really helps to see things in person and practice with the field guide. And if you can't make it on Saturday, we will be having the Starry Trek event again. That will be in August, so I will send out details on that as well.
That's good.
Very good. Thank you, Liz. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Nathan.